I think the role of academia has at least three different functions. One is to develop basic knowledge of a foundational kind, like what is going on in terms of the economic impact of China on Africa. Like that's useful foundational understanding of what is actually happening. It may or may not be relevant to policy, but it's very important knowledge. Secondly, academics, I think, are involved in the critical assessment of, what works. It's not just evaluation, but it's just sort of saying we've spent, like for example, one, and I would disagree with her, Dambisa Moyo wrote Dead Aid, and she said we've spent $40 billion in Africa and poverty rates have hardly shifted at all in 30 years. So what does this tell us about aid and its effectiveness in terms of poverty alleviation? Well, her conclusion was not much. It's not a very efficient exercise. So that is a kind of debating critical analysis function that academics can have, very important. And lastly, as a much more practical thing, I think academics can talk about what works and what doesn't work. What are the interventions? And if you look at the medical science area, this is what they do all day, all the time. They just say, what works better to reduce this kind of cancer, this kind of drug versus that kind of drug. Let's use scientific empirical methods to determine what works. And so that's a very useful function for academics as well. It's heavy intellectual activity. So those kind of three things the academics can do, and government needs that to be done. If it's good policy development, it'll steal and harvest from each of these three areas of activity.